All right. All right. Fiscal policy and the national debt. So fiscal policy is, of course, how governments influence the economy to the best of their ability with government spending, increasing, decreasing taxes. So if we're facing a recession, what do you think the government might want to step in and do to solve that problem and get the economy going?
Spend money.
Spend money? Sure. Spend money. And the other thing they can do is, starts with T, ends with X.
Decrease taxes.
Taxes. Yes, tax less. Right. Like tax less. How do you spell taxes? Tax, T-A-X. Singular. All right, so they can spend more, they can decrease taxes, and we'll think about how that plays out. Now, we're talking about discretionary fiscal policy. Now, when Congress makes a budget, there are things called entitlements, which you may have heard of, which in the short term, the government doesn't choose whether or not they pay those entitlements. And entitlements is a huge part of the budget. I don't know, 60%, something in that neighborhood. So those are things in the short term Congress can't change. But the remaining part, discretionary spending, things the government can do to influence the economy based on the need. All right, so discretionary fiscal policy, the deliberate use of changes in government spending or taxes to alter aggregate demand. All right, expansionary fiscal policy. So suppose we're facing a recession, the government wants to get the economy going again. Let's increase government spending. Not a bad idea. Decrease taxes, or increase government spending and taxes equally. And we'll talk about how that can have a positive effect. So we're increasing government spending, and we're also increasing taxes, which would cool off the economy. So spending spurs the economy, taxes cool off the economy. But we'll see that the government spending has a slightly larger effect than increasing the taxes. So there's a net positive result there. Does that make sense? All right, so the spending spurs the economy, increase in taxes cools off the economy, but the spending has a larger effect. The government can also decide to cool off the economy if we're worried about inflation. We haven't talked too much about the danger of inflation, but we've talked a little bit about it. We'll talk more next week about how the government wants to monitor inflation and warn against that or fend off inflation. So, in an inflationary environment, when the economy is really hot, the government may say it's time to step back and spend less. It's time to increase taxes and start thinking about paying off our national debt, or decrease government spending and taxes equally. And that, the government spending has a larger effect than the tax decrease. Right, so we're in the middle of a recession. Government steps in, says let's increase spending or decrease taxes, increase aggregate demand, and that increases our GDP, and that sometimes has the effect of increasing the price level. Let's just look at that graphically. If I can just give that. So, aggregate demand, this is our aggregate demand curve, and then remember our aggregate supply curve. Let's just do a quick refresh. Remember, economists like three different components of the aggregate supply curve. They say there are three different ranges. Remember what they are? Can anyone tell me?
Keynesian.
Keynesian range here, all right, and we've got the intermediate range, and we've got what range here? Classical, fantastic. So, if we increase aggregate demand, we could increase our real GDP and get back to full employment. Depending on what range we're in, we may face a slight problem, not a huge problem, but a slight problem with increasing price level and a moderate amount of inflation. All right. So, in the government's attempts to get the economy going, there's some very good news called the spending multiplier. Has anyone heard of that before? All right, so the concept there is, if the government spends money, there's going to be a ripple effect, a positive ripple effect in the economy. So the government spends $100 million building a new school. All right, that $100 million, they have to pay the contractor, they have to pay the designer, they have to pay the architects. All those people who get that money, they go out and spend it on other things. So the person who does the concrete, or the company that does the concrete, that company goes out and buys more tools. That company goes out and hires people. The people that are hired, they go out and they spend that money at the restaurant. They spend the money on their kids' new sneakers and stuff. And so there is that multiplier effect, which is very positive for economic growth. And the multiplier effect, calculating that, depends on how much money the people involved with that are going to spend and how much money they're going to save. So, suppose you get a new project, a new deal that maybe you weren't expecting, and that brings in an extra $100 of revenue for you. So, you hadn't budgeted this, you weren't planning on it, all of a sudden you've got an extra $100 in your bank account. Question is, how much of that $100 do you spend, and how much of that $100 do you save? Because there's only two options. You either spend it or you save it. So we'll call the amount that you spend your marginal propensity to consume. And we'll call the amount that you save your marginal propensity to save. Marginal propensity to consume is the change in consumption resulting from a 1 unit change in income. So suppose your marginal propensity to consume is 80%. You're going to spend $80 of that $100 extra you got, and you're going to save $20. Marginal propensity to consume, 80%. Marginal propensity to save, 20%. We talked last time about how politicians will often try to encourage spending. I used the example of 2001 where we got the tax rebate, where George W. Bush actually made a concerted effort to say, you should go out and spend that money. Go out and buy yourself a new deck or hire someone to build a deck. So politicians might encourage more consumption, which would magnify this ripple effect. All right, so when we calculate this spending multiplier, we take 1 over the marginal propensity to save, and your textbook calls this 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Let's look at some of the figures in calculating this. So suppose I have a marginal propensity to consume of 90%. I find $100, I'm going to spend 90 of it. What is the spending multiplier effect? Well, it's 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save, which if my consumption is 90%, my savings is 10%. So 1 divided by 0.1, 10. Suppose I don't consume that much. I only consume 80%. $80 out of that $100 extra I get, I spend 80, save 20. So 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. You with me? So, how are we going to have the biggest effect on getting the economy going if we're government officials and we're going to spend a little bit more? Well, we might do exactly what George W. Bush did. Give people money back and say, go out and spend it. Go out and spend it. Because the spending multiplier effect can ultimately have a very significant impact on getting us out of a recession. All right, so we've got some figures here. You can see as the amount of consumption goes down, the spending multiplier also goes down. Makes sense? All right. Okay, so for example, suppose we have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.5. We're going to consume 50% of whatever we find. What is the spending multiplier? 1 divided by 0.5 is 2. So as an example, how much will real GDP increase with an increase in government spending of 1,000 billion, which is $1 trillion. Can somebody explain that calculation to me? We've got a spending multiplier of 2, and we've got increasing government spending of 1 trillion. How much does real GDP increase? Give me a chance to stop talking for a minute. Andres?
Oh, 2 billion, right?
Right? Okay. Break it down for me. Just summarize the components.
The 1 billion in the government spending times the multiplier, which is 2.
Yep.
Would be 2 billion.
Yep. And how did we get this multiplier of 2?
The spending multiplier is the marginal propensity to consume divided by
It's
1 divided by the marginal propensity to save.
exactly. 1 divided by. So the more that consumers spend, the higher that multiplier is going to be. In this case, it's 2. So $1 billion increase in government spending has a ripple effect. Excuse me, I keep saying 1 billion. It's 1 trillion. So this is $1 trillion. Let's look at the next slide and think about how this ripple effect calculates. So initially, government spending is going to increase by $1 trillion. The people who receive that $1 trillion for building the schools, for consulting the government on whatever, for doing things that the government pays for, they are going to spend half of that money. So now we're up to 1.5 trillion. The people they pay with their money, they're going to turn around and spend half that. So now we're up to 1.75 trillion. That process is going to go on and on and on until we get too close to $2 trillion. So that's our spending multiplier effect. The more people are consuming, the more powerful that is. Question?
Well, I was interested in how we determine what the people are going to spend and how we come up with that marginal propensity to consume. Because, like, for instance, I'm thinking about right now, following the recession, people are keeping money in the banks. They're taking money out of stocks. And so the president, or even Bush, the president is not going to be able to persuade people to go out and spend. I mean, there's got to be something else that kind of encourages that. And so theoretically, yes, it all works. But how do we get people to, in fact, spend the money? They can do other things with the money. I mean, coming right out of the recession, a lot of people went out of business, lost a lot of money, lost houses, that type of thing. And so now people are saving. Businesses aren't expanding. We look at the job reports on a regular basis. It's growing, but it's still kind of anemic. So,
all right, let's ask the economic team. How are we going to encourage people to spend more money?
Put everything on sale.
Put things on sale. Fantastic. Show the consumers signs of an expansion. Show them we're actually coming out of a recession. You don't need to sock this away for a rainy day because things are looking brighter tomorrow. Of course, the president could continue to make speeches. I think during the Depression, was it FDR gave that nothing to fear but fear itself,
right,
was very much economic related. It was, so if we all think we're in the middle of a depression and no one spends, then we're going to be in the middle of a depression. But if we start spending more, if we start, then people will start hiring more, and that virtuous cycle will get us out of this. So, trying to restore consumer confidence, sales, and inspirational speeches. Yeah. All right. So good question. We'll continue to think about that as we go on with this discussion. So let's look at the tax multiplier. So this is the same sort of concept. The change in aggregate demand resulting from initial change in taxes. So instead of spending $1 trillion, we could give consumers $1 trillion back. All right, put that in their pockets. Now, the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier. The reason is there's one less round of spending for the tax multiplier. Let me click back to here. You see this in the spending multiplier calculation. Initially, the government spends an extra $1 trillion, and then half of that money is spent by the people it's spent on, so on and so forth. With taxes, this initial round of spending never happens. So the government, instead of spending $1 trillion, they give it back to the consumers. And suppose the marginal propensity to consume is 50%. What happens to that $1 trillion? Half of it is spent. So we erase this initial part, so we just get all of this. So the tax multiplier effect is smaller than the spending multiplier effect. And that's going to be important to us as we talk about raising spending and raising taxes at the same time as maybe being a good idea. Okay, so tax multiplier formula, 1 minus the spending multiplier. So suppose we have a spending multiplier of 2. What is the tax multiplier? 1 minus 2. We could call it -1 if we wanted to, but economists just say, let's call it 1 because we all know the inverse relationship between taxes and spending. So tax multiplier, 1 minus the spending multiplier. Question, how much does real GDP decrease with an increase of taxes of 1 trillion? All right, can someone break that down for me? How did we come up with that figure? I put Andres on the spot last time. Just walk me through the calculations. Take it away, Lonnie.
Just like the spending multiplier, where you multiply the spending multiplier by the change in GDP, here you are multiplying the tax multiplier by the change in taxes.
Exactly. Change.
1,000 billion? No.
1 trillion, yeah.
Times 1.
Times 1 is we've got a change in real GDP of $1 trillion. Fantastic. Question, what will happen to aggregate demand if both government spending and taxes are increased by $1 trillion? Well, we know that the spending is going to have a larger effect than taxes. Break it down on the next slide. So we've got a $1 trillion increase in government spending. We've got a $1 trillion tax cut. Now, both of these things are designed to spur the economy. So the government is spending an extra $1 trillion, and the government is also cutting taxes by $1 trillion. We know that spending this $1 trillion with the multiplier is going to have an effect of increasing real GDP by $2 trillion. And we know that cutting taxes is going to have an impact of increasing GDP by $1 trillion. So total increase in GDP, $3 trillion. $2 trillion comes from the spending increase. $1 trillion comes from the tax cut. So we spent $1 trillion, we cut taxes by $1 trillion, boom, we increased GDP by $3 trillion. And if we could encourage people to spend even more, it may be higher than that. So, economists look at this and they say, well, we can't cut taxes forever because we need tax revenue to have something to spend. And so this is not necessarily going to work long term. So economists get the idea, and you may have guessed where I was going with this. Why don't we increase spending by $1 trillion and increase taxes by $1 trillion? So we increase taxes, so we have $1 trillion more to spend, and then we spend it. So everybody wins, right?
When you talk about taxes, it's income tax?
Both, or
Like
all of the above.
Sales tax,
Corporate taxes, business taxes, income tax, social security taxes.
sales tax?
Sales tax, yes.
Can you just choose to increase sales tax?
Okay.
Right there?
All right. So you're bringing up the important issue. This is one of the reasons why economists don't and government officials don't just jump to do exactly what I just said. So let's get to that in 1 minute. But let's just ruminate on theoretically how this could work. We're going to increase taxes by $1 trillion, and we're going to use that money to increase spending by $1 trillion. Tell me the effect on the economy. What's that?
It's going to be a negative effect because if you increase taxes, people are going to spend less.
All right, so let's look at them one at a time. So we're going to increase spending by $1 trillion, and assume the spending multiplier is 2. So what's going to happen to real GDP? Yeah, increase. All right, so we're increasing spending by $1 trillion. So increase real GDP by $2 trillion. All right, so that's a good start. We're also increasing taxes by $1 trillion. That's going to decrease real GDP. How much is that going to decrease real GDP? So let's see. Spending.
1
All right. Increase. Tax. Increase. Okay, so let's see. 1 billion. Tax increase of 1 billion. Okay, so I want to know effect of real GDP. Real GDP. All right. So spending increase of $1 trillion. We're assuming marginal propensity to consume equals 0.5. So we spend $1 trillion. What's the effect on real GDP? Increase by how much? $2 trillion. Exactly. So $2 trillion. All right, we're off to a good start. Now, in order to fund that $1 trillion in spending, we increase taxes by $1 trillion. What's the effect that's going to have on real GDP? Remember, taxes have a slightly less effect because of the smaller multiplier.
Decrease 500.
Let's go back. I think you actually did this one for us. How much does real GDP decrease with an increase in taxes of $1 trillion? Exactly. Down $1 trillion. Net effect is what? Increase. All right, increase of $1 trillion. Right? Right? You with me? So we increase taxes by $1 trillion. We use that money to increase spending by $1 trillion. And the net effect on real GDP was an increase of $1 trillion. Everybody wins. Right? So we should do this. Right? And Lonnie brought up some points where it gets complicated, but this is not a trick question. This is not a bad way to think about spurring the economy. It gets difficult when we think about how the taxes are going to increase, who we increase taxes for, all those moving parts when the political discussion starts. But the theory is there. The tax multiplier has a smaller effect on the economy. And this is theoretically a great way to spur the economy. Any questions? All right. Let's see. Conclusion, a tax cut has a smaller multiplier effect on the aggregate demand than an equal increase in government spending. A couple of notes on marginal propensity to consume. It can change from one time period to another. It varies among individuals. So we just use estimates. in our calculations. All right, so let's talk about a couple of the different theories that we had discussed before of how we're going to get this economy going because it's in recession. What do you think Keynes is going to say? John Maynard Keynes. How would he tell us to get an economy back on track that is in recession?
Increase government spending, keep wages and prices constant.
Yeah. He's going to say increase government spending, and he's going to say, and guess what? Wages and prices are going to probably stay constant. But he's going to say increase government spending. Remember, I told you how I memorized the keys? Yes, John Maynard Keynes. I think of keys. Right? The government has to step in and help the economy because it's not self-correcting. Classical economists say the economy in recession is self-correcting. So John Maynard Keynes is going to say increase government spending, decrease taxes, do what you can to spur economic growth. So suppose aggregate demand is here. Keynes says increase demand by increased spending and decrease taxes. We're going to get back to full employment. Depending on where we are on that curve, there could be a slight increase in price level. Sometimes, one thing I'll point out, sometimes, actually I mentioned this earlier in class, but sometimes lawmakers will use fiscal policy to combat inflation. So suppose we're in a really hot economic period, inflation is going higher than we were comfortable with, we could just decrease spending, increase taxes to cool off the economy, and it would have the effect of, suppose aggregate demand is here, suppose we decide to decrease spending. All right, we have a new equilibrium. We're still at full employment because we're in a really hot economic time. And suppose we're in the classical range of that aggregate supply curve. Price level goes down, our real GDP stays constant. Great problem to have, right? If our economy is so hot and we're in this classical region, and remember we talked about this classical range being, if we're at full employment, we really can't produce more no matter how high the price goes. So if we spend just a little bit less, we're not sacrificing employment. All right, so we've got some Keynesian views on spurring a weak economy. We've got a similar understanding of how we might cool off an economy using that same logic. This is just for inflation, summarizing inflation. Let me talk about something we call automatic stabilizers. All right, these are things in the economy that automatically kick in to offset either a recession or an overly or a dangerous expansionary period. Federal expenditures and tax revenues that automatically change levels in order to stabilize an economic expansion or contraction. So, if the economy is really, really hot, GDP is really high, and we're worried about inflation, we have automatic stabilizers that help with that before the government even starts to think about stepping in. And that is, when the economy is hot, there are more taxes collected. So, the more taxes the government collects, the less money there is in the economy, and that has an effect of cooling off an economy that may be in danger of going too high with inflation. Similarly, if we're in the middle of a recession, there are transfer payments that increase, such as unemployment insurance, welfare, other government subsidies that would kick in when people are out of work, people are unemployed, and that increases the amount of money in the economy. That make sense? Got automatic stabilizers. Examples of automatic stabilizers: transfer payments, welfare, unemployment compensation, tax collections. Tax collections is the one that cools off the economy that's overheating. These first three are ones that can prop up an economy that's entering a recession. I'm going to come back to this summary in a minute. I want to skip right to this graph which summarizes automatic stabilizers. Let's take a look at that for a minute and make sure we're comfortable with that. Maybe I could even get 2 volunteers to explain to me what's happening with both of these lines. We've got real GDP on the horizontal axis. We've got government spending on the vertical axis. And we've got this G line, which represents government spending. And we've got this T line, which represents taxes. So, somebody, let me get 2 volunteers. Maybe one person to walk me through what's happening with government spending, one person to walk me through what's happening with taxes. All right, don't all jump at once. Go for it, Luke.
As the government spending line represents as the GDP decreases, the government has to spend more to bring it back up.
Yes,
And
it'll spend more.
Decreases when you have a large GDP.
Right. Okay, so as GDP is low, now it doesn't have to, this is automatic. All right, unemployment, welfare, programs that might kick in when people are out of work or we're in a recession.
Right.
Government spends more, and that pumps a little bit more in the economy. And then what happens here?
The taxes are inversely.
Yeah, all right. So as
So-
people are doing well, they
Right.
don't have to pay as much in
Correct.
unemployment insurance, so the government spending goes down.
And then GDP is good, they can tax more because wealth is better, they're spending more.
Okay, all right. So we're moving on to taxes. So talk me through taxes.
So as taxes increase, your GDP is better because as they have a larger GDP.
Wait. Just talk in terms of GDP is
Oh.
low or high when it comes to taxes.
So at low GDP, they can't tax or increase taxes because there's
Well, this is automatic. It's like automatic. Suppose,
less to
Nobody works.
spend to take it away from people.
suppose you
Say-
pay 33% in taxes, and next year you make $5,000. All right, no fault of the government, no decisions by the government. You just maybe lost your job or transitioned. You only make $5,000. You pay a small amount of taxes. Taxes are low. All right, the following year you make $150,000. How much more in taxes does the government get?
More.
A lot. So it's an automatic stabilizer. As people are making more money, the government collects more taxes and pays less in these entitlement type of things. So let's go to the budget deficit and budget surplus logic. So why do we have a budget surplus in this situation?
There's less taxes to pay for all that spending that the government has to do.
Yeah, the government has to pay a lot to get us out of this recession. Well, it's automatic. They could pay more, but because the people are unemployed and they're collecting less taxes, so they have a deficit. All right, we don't like having a deficit, but it's at least we're working to spur the economy to hopefully get us out of this recession. Now, how about the surplus? What's going on here? How do we add up all those parts to get a surplus?
You have a high GDP, so government doesn't have to spend as much.
Yes.
And there's more room to collect taxes.
Yep, you made $150,000 and the government collected a good chunk of that, and they didn't have to pay unemployment insurance for it. Okay, so we've got Keynesian theory about how we get out of an economy. We understand economic stabilizers. And we understand a little bit about how we would combat inflation using traditional methods. Supply side. All right, now we're talking supply side. This is where it gets exciting. Fiscal policy that emphasizes government policies that increase aggregate supply. Let me skip ahead to a graph. So this is the stuff we've been talking about before, how we can change demand. So suppose we're here at this point, equilibrium. All right, we've got aggregate demand here, we've got aggregate supply here. We've only talked about things we can do to change aggregate demand. And that's fine. We increase demand, we get full employment, we have slight inflation. It's not a huge problem. We don't like inflation, but it's not a terrible problem. What if instead of increasing demand, we thought of a way to shift this supply curve to the right. What about that? What do you think? What would happen, just theoretically, if we were able to come up with a way to do that? Like, what would happen to the new equilibrium if we were to shift this red line to the right?
Decrease in demand,
Decrease.
increase in supply.
Oh
No, it'd be an actual shift.
Yeah, actual shift. Yeah.
it'd be a shift to the right.
Shift to the right. Yeah. What happens? What happens to GDP and price level? Go ahead, Crystal.
Increase,
Increase of what?
increase GDP,
Yes. And what happens to price level?
doesn't remain the same,
Decrease.
or decrease?
It decreases. Decreases. All right. So we're on to something here. We're increasing GDP and we're decreasing price level. Isn't that great?
No, that doesn't make sense.
So, all right, so we're going to shift the aggregate supply curve here. So our equilibrium was here. Now our new equilibrium is here. Price level goes down, GDP goes up.
Right.
And we don't hate inflation, but we would prefer not to have inflation. Economists just say, all right, a healthy amount of inflation is fine. But if we can increase aggregate demand, increase GDP without increasing inflation, in fact, maybe even working to decrease it, that's even better. So that's supply side. The supply side economists said, why don't we shift the aggregate supply to the right? And we'll get the best of everything. You with me, Luke?
Yep.
Yeah. So this has been very popular thinking. Now the problem with this, actually before I get to the problem with this, let me ask you, how would we do it? How would we increase aggregate supply? How would we shift that to the right? We are the government's economic team.
You would have to increase output of production.
Okay, how would we do it?
Governments would have to increase spending to incentivize suppliers.
Sure, okay, so we could develop some programs where we're going to help businesses be more efficient. We're going to train business owners. We're going to set up maybe small business administration programs where we can get people loans. We might decrease regulation. Might say, all right, we're not going to be all over you on these whole regulations. You just grow and you do your thing. And we're going to give you some incentives to send your people back to school, to increase their job skills so we can shift everything to the right.
That would put more investment in the supplier company too.
Yeah.
Increase the skilled labor, so.
Increase this, yes, fantastic. So this is how we would do it. And this is great stuff. These are great ideas. The reason why there's mixed reviews and not as much enthusiasm for doing this sort of economic shift is it tends to disproportionately benefit really rich people. Because if we're helping businesses, people look at that and they say, well, Goldman Sachs, they're already really rich. Do we really need to help them even more? Do we need to decrease regulations on Goldman Sachs and the other financial companies? Well, maybe we could. All right? If we do, we decrease regulations, we can shift aggregate supply this way. We can decrease price level and we can increase demand. All right. We're going to continue talking about this concept for a little while. Let me see what else I wanted to say as I set up this discussion. So this is supply side. It's easier to see if we just look at it as a traditional straight curve. So we have an equilibrium here, and we do everything Luke was talking about to increase aggregate supply, decrease regulations, give businesses more incentives, and get people to work more too. Decrease taxes on employment, say, or investment also. And we're going to shift, we're going to decrease price level, increase real GDP. All right. And then the goal of this is to achieve long-run growth in real output, have full employment at a lower price level. All great stuff. Decrease resource prices, technological advances, subsidies, decrease in regulations. And that all is going to increase the aggregate supply curve. I believe that is going to... Okay, so let's talk about this. We mentioned briefly employment. So suppose we give workers a tax cut. We say, if you work more, we will tax you less. That would give people the incentive to work a little bit more, right? And so folks would say, I'm going to work a little bit more at the same price level. So this is the labor curve. So wages decrease, price level decreases. All right, output increases. Okay, and we're going to talk about this as we get to the Laffer curve. So let me set up the Laffer curve. Has anyone heard of the Laffer curve before? All right. This is a relationship between how much we tax workers and how much they might work, therefore how much tax revenue the government would collect. So the theory with this Laffer curve is that the more we increase taxes on workers, the less they're going to work. So as we increase taxes, we're going to get a little bit more in tax revenue, but workers are going to work less, and that's going to cool off the economy. GDP is going to shrink. And there's going to be a point where we've increased taxes so much, we actually decrease the tax revenue that we're collecting. So let me go to the Laffer curve and talk that through. So we've got on the horizontal axis the tax rate starting at 0, going up to 100. And we've got the tax revenue collected starting at 0, going up to the max revenue we could possibly collect. So if taxes are 0, obviously we're not collecting any tax revenue. The tax rate is 0. So as we increase the tax rate, we're going to collect more in taxes. But you see how this curve is increasing at a decreasing rate? So it's increasing because we're increasing the tax rate and we're collecting more revenue, but each time we increase it one notch more, the theory is that people work a little bit less. They say, if I'm going to have to give it all away, I'm going to work a little bit less. And then ultimately, we're going to get to the point where the more we increase taxes, we're going to be sacrificing so much of our tax revenue that the total tax revenue is going to go down. So suppose we're at this point, point C. We have our tax rate here and our tax revenue here. Looking at that, what might you advise for someone working in government to increase tax revenue? So we're at point C. You as the economic advisor, how do you tell President so-and-so to increase tax revenue? Keep it at B. Yeah, what does keep it at B mean? What do we need to change?
Tax rate?
Decrease the tax rate to that point.
Exactly. We decrease the tax rate to this point. All right. So what do y'all think of this supply side theory? We're going to make things easier on the suppliers. We're going to make give companies incentives to supply more. We're going to help with technological advancements. We're going to decrease regulation. And then in terms of the labor supply, We're going to give the folks who are working a break on their taxes so they'll work more. So they're working more, the companies are able to produce more, we're going to shift that whole supply curve to the right, increase real GDP, decrease prices. What do y'all think about this?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Yeah. All right, it does. Sounds good. There's some good things about it. I'm going to talk about the cons of this, but I don't want to take away from the fact that this is a powerful and important economic theory. And what might be the potential problems with this?
I think it depends.
Yeah, tell
It
me.
depends on the aspect. Like when you said they could say, for example, decrease regulations for an aspect of environmental, that could be a problem. You decrease regulations at the expense of the environment, you're polluting.
Yes.
Same thing can be said for public safety. So I mean, if you incentivize the supplier too much, you're losing the purchasing power of the consumer.
Yes. Yes. All right. So we're incentivizing.
Or in terms of the environment.
Or the
say
environment.
public.
So
Say
we're
the
ruining the
public,
environment potentially. We're allowing banks
Right.
to do things that aren't best for the consumer.
Right.
Where we are in the pockets of Wall Street, as Bernie Sanders might say. We are helping big business. So that's in terms of just helping businesses.
Right. But like I said, it could be it depends on the aspect. Like say economical in terms of say Wall Street. If you're incentivizing those suppliers, they may be more enticed to purchase more capital, and then in turn, they might increase the influence of banks, and they might loan more.
Yes, that's great.
And
That's
influence the interest rate.
That's great. So we've got on the one
Right.
hand and on the other hand.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah,
It
it's
just
got its pros and cons. So I think it really it's how you look at it.
It depends. All right, the other thing I'll point out is I just presented this as it was intended. I said if the tax rate is higher, that would incline you to work less. But is that really a reality? I mean, when's the last time you said, "Yeah, my tax rate is so high, so I don't want to work as much"? No.
No,
In the long run, you
I want money. I work.
It's probably never been experienced by anyone in this room. Or where you said, I don't want to do another deal because I'm going to have to give 60% of it to the government. So let me just not do that.
My husband says it though when they offer him overtime.
He does? Okay.
Because the tax rate is so high for the overtime that it's not worth going.
Okay. So, all right. So I take that back. So some people in this room have had some personal experience with this.
Depends on the overtime.
All right.
So it could put you into a different tax bracket depending on what your salary
That's
is.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if I'm not getting time and a half on my overtime, I'm not taking it if it's
Right.
regular pay.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go up to double time too, that's good. But then
Yeah.
that's
You're
all.
taking
That's
the
all for after tax basis
Yeah.
too. So they tax
That's
that
right.
too, and they tax it even more. So
Yeah.
they do have a point.
Okay.
At the,
You
end,
know,
at the end of the
you're
year,
making more,
they
but
see
they're
your
taxing.
salary is your total income. So
So absolutely. All right, there is definitely validity to this, but it doesn't tend to affect the lower income workers or even the middle income workers as much. People in the lower income brackets say, I just want as much work as I can possibly get. They don't think, all right, if I work this extra more, I'm going to have to pay in taxes. Similarly, people who are in the middle income range might have a similar thought process. Maybe every once in a while they might say, like Lonnie's husband, I don't know if it's worth it to go in. But this is not as much of a consideration for people in the middle or lower income ranges. It is a consideration for people who are in the highest tax brackets, though. And, okay, so this supply-side economics tends to help big businesses. It also tends to help people who are in a very high income bracket. This was very popular in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan's administration. Many of you have heard of Reaganomics. All right, Ronald Reagan was a supply-side economist. He liked the idea of increasing aggregate supply by being friendly to business and decreasing taxes. All right, let's get the government off the backs of the working people. All right, a lot of politicians have used that line. This Laffer curve, I was looking up some research on the Laffer curve as I was preparing to teach this today, and I found a couple of interesting things. This guy who popularized it, he wasn't the one who invented it, but he was working in, what's his name? Gerald Ford's administration. All right, in 1974, this guy named Andrew Laffer, he was meeting with some Ford administration officials by the name of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Do you remember those names? All right, so this was Andrew Laffer, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld in 1974, and he draws the now Laffer curve on a napkin. He says, hey, here's this curve, which tells us if we're here, let's decrease taxes and let's increase tax revenue. All right, apparently Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney say, that's a fantastic idea. Let's do it. The problem for them was, in 1976, Gerald Ford lost re-election, and Jimmy Carter won. So they were out for 4 years. Then what happened in 1980? Ronald Reagan wins, and they're back in. And they say, let's convince Ronald Reagan to do this Laffer curve. Let's work with him on popularizing this supply-side economic thinking. And that's what Ronald Reagan did. That's what Ronald Reagan was famous for. Does anyone remember one of the ways Ronald Reagan described supply-side economics?
Trickle-down economics.
Trickle-down economics. Yes. I think probably one of the worst names.
It's probably the most notorious economic policy of the Republican Party.
Yes.
Ever since Reagan.
If for no other reason in the way they named it. Like, trickle down.
Yeah.
Do I want to be the person
They
who's
talk
being
economics, that's what you hear.
trickled down upon? Now, of course, we understand why that makes sense. It's helped the businesses, right? And they will in turn spur the economy and help everyone. It will trickle down. The benefits will trickle down on everyone. But it disproportionately helps people who are higher income workers, and those lower income workers say, I don't like this. But apparently, Ronald Reagan had tremendous success with this. He decreased the tax rate overall, and he increased tax revenues. Of course, Ronald Reagan was spending so much on the Cold War that he was running a deficit the whole time, but his economic plan was useful with this trickle-down supply side. All right, so any questions or thoughts? Supply side economics, the Laffer curve. All right, let me think about this. Do we want to take a break now? Do we want to keep going? Keep going?
Well, how long are we going to keep going?
What's that?
How long are we going to keep going?
Well, we can take a break later if we end up going too long.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so let's go ahead. We'll talk about federal deficits, surpluses, and the national debt. All right. So, federal deficits, surpluses, and national debt. Let's make sure we're clear on what all of those are before we get into definitions. What's a federal deficit and a federal surplus? Deficit. What's a federal deficit?
Not enough.
Not enough. Okay, deficit, not
Spending
enough.
more than bringing in.
So when the government is making a budget, and they may make a budget where they are paying out more than they're bringing in, and they're at a deficit. They may be at a deficit of $500 billion, $500 billion. Might be a deficit that the government is at. So we're paying out more than we're bringing in. So the federal budget is at a deficit. A surplus would be the opposite of that. We're bringing in more than we're putting out. That's good. That's preferable, right? You want to be bringing in more than you're putting out if you want to run an effective anything. Now, what happens if the government operates at a budget deficit over and over again? Each year, we're at a deficit. What happens?
Have to increase borrowing, treasury bonds.
We have to borrow the money. We have to get the money
They
somewhere,
need the money.
right? And we create the national debt, right? We borrow money and we don't pay it back the next year. And the next year, in fact, we borrow more money. And then the year after that, we borrow more money. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So when we're deciding our federal budgets, that has a large effect on our national debt. So we'll look at federal budgets and we'll look at the national debt. And again, we're going to think about how we can solve this problem of the national debt. So, how budgetary process formulates in the finances of our national debt. Why or why not we should worry about national debt. Budget process. All right, the president submits a budget to Congress in February. There's a budget resolution, apparently in May. Budget passes, president signs the budget into order, and that brings us to our fiscal year, which is a little bit different than the actual year, October 30th through October 1st through September 30th. So there's a process where Congress is working with the president, and the president back and forth, vice versa. They're arguing over various things, and hopefully we have a budget signed into effect before October 1st. We'll talk about sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes in recent history where there's been delays and political fights about that. All right, so just reiterating some terms. If we're operating at a surplus, the amount by which the government tax collections exceed expenditures, so we're collecting more in tax than we're spending. That's great, we want a surplus. Deficit is the opposite. The amount by which the government expenditures exceed tax collections. We're spending more than we're collecting. All right, let's take a look at what has happened with federal budget surpluses and deficits over the recent past. So the last time we were running a federal surplus, a budget surplus, was in 2001. So 1998, 99, 2000, 2001, we had a budget surplus. And this graph is in billions of dollars. So in 2000, we had a surplus of $236 billion. Not bad. In 2000, $178 billion. And then what's happened since then? Budget deficits. All right, we had a couple things happen in 2001 that contributed to that, and some even worse things that happened in 2009 that contributed to that. Let's think through what was going on in 2001 and what was going on in 2009 that may have led to this drastic decrease in this unfortunate budget deficit. 2001, let's start with that. What happened there?
September 11th.
Yeah, September 11th happened. That contributed. There was an increase in spending on the war on terrorism that significantly added to the deficit. So we had to spend a lot more on military. And there was also a recession at that time. So what happens during a recession? Well, we talked about this automatic stabilizer thing. So during a recession, we have to spend more automatically on government entitlements, welfare, that sort of thing. And during a recession, we are collecting less in taxes. So we have a budget deficit. All right, now what happened in 2009? Crazy recession, right? And look at that. Isn't that scary? We jump from surpluses, last time we've seen that in 2000, to these look scary enough. Just being at a deficit for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years in a row. And then all of a sudden, our budget deficit goes all the way to $1.4 trillion. So, all right, recent past federal budgets and surpluses. Federal expenditures and tax revenues as a percentage of GDP. Okay, so here we have from 1990 to 2013, I believe, and we've got this solid line is federal expenditures. The dotted line is federal taxes collected. So this is our federal surplus, 1998 to 2001, where the taxes increased the federal deficit. And before that, we were operating at, the federal taxes were higher than government spending. Before that, we were acting in a deficit. I guess this doesn't go into, we're coming off the 1980s where we had massive spending for the Cold War, even though Ronald Reagan's policies were resulting in higher tax revenues than we were previously experiencing. All right, and then 2001, we have the recession. So tax revenue decreases, spending jumps up and remains stable until 2009. Look at that. Oh my God. Doesn't that look scary? Tax revenues decrease significantly, spending goes up sharply. We have a sea of red.
Looks healthy.
What's that?
Looks healthy.
Looks, you're being sarcastic. Yeah. All right. So this is looking pretty scary. What else do we have to put this in context? All right. So comparison of government surpluses and deficits as a percentage of GDP. We've got the United States. Our budget as a percentage of GDP is negative 4%. So what that means is we have a GDP of, say, $16 trillion, and we have a deficit on average, or a deficit in 2013 of 4% of that. So our budget deficit is 4% of GDP. Okay, we talked about this, what happened in 2001, recession, tax cuts, and increased spending on the war on terrorism meant a return to deficits. All right, we also talked about the fact that if we're constantly running at a deficit, we're just going to be adding up more in our national debt. In order to finance that deficit, we're going to need to borrow money. We're going to need to sell bonds. The U.S. Treasury will sell securities saying, here, give me $1 billion, I will pay you interest payments, and then I will give you that $1 billion back at some later point. And when we do that over and over and over again, the national debt increases. And now for the really scary part. Let's take a look at what's going on in this graph. National debt 1930 to 2013. We've got year 1930 to 2013 on the horizontal graph. We've got trillions of dollars on the vertical graph.
Who do we borrow money from?
Okay, good question. We borrow a lot of money from China. We also, we borrow a lot of money from other places, but we also borrow some of that money from ourselves. Like you might contribute by buying a bond, a U.S. government bond. So we'll talk about that later as some potential good news. So if we are holding some of the debt ourselves, then it's not all bad news. All right, but tell me about this graph. Somebody just explain it to me, and let's think about the implications. Andres, take it away.
pretty much the national debt has increased tremendously from 1980 till today, and it was pretty, it's pretty much streamlined from the 30s to about 1980.
Yeah, a reasonable amount. Okay, in the 1980 we have drastic increases. This graph doesn't show it, but it went down at one little point here. Like it actually went down. There was the national debt went down for like a second, a split second. But this is just, I guess, connecting main points. And it went up, and where's our debt now? 17 trillion? Or 2013, I guess, is 17 trillion. All right, so this is looking bad. $17 trillion in national debt because we've been running deficits like crazy. National debt is a percentage of GDP. This is just often a frame of reference. What's the percentage of our GDP that we owe in debt? Let's start at the end. Let's start where we are right now, or as of 2013. What is our national debt as a percentage of GDP in 2013? 100%. Okay, so our GDP is about $16 trillion. Our national debt is about $16 trillion.
Nice.
So we think of GDP as a rough approximation of our salary, right? How much salary this whole country is making, $16 trillion, and that's how much we owe. Now, I was thinking about this, Dr. Williams and I were talking about this before class, that is that a huge amount of debt?
No, because we'll just increase our credit line.
We increase our credit line. And also we're thinking if you buy a house, like you could buy a house that is worth more than your annual income.
Well, yeah, mortgage.
Yeah, a mortgage. So you might get a
Debt
mortgage.
management.
Yeah, so if your salary is like $100,000, you could get a mortgage for, say, $250,000. So your debt payments, or your debt to income ratio, is 2.5 to 1. So we don't think that's too terrible, right? But because in that case, though, we have a plan to pay it off, and we would expect that we would pay this off at some point in the future. What about our national debt? Do we have a plan to pay this off at some point in the future?
Sure.
Maybe, maybe not. We're actually going to come up with one tonight, right? I forgot about that.
Mass printing of money.
Okay, yeah, we'll talk
Just
about.
kidding. No, that'll deplete the power of the dollar. That would be useless.
Exactly. All right, so we're at 100%. Our GDP, our debt is a percentage of GDP. This has steadily increased. It reached a height in World War II because, of course, there's massive military spending in that era. But it decreased significantly after that. Until 1980, I guess we increased spending for the Cold War. And I guess it went down. This is the part where it went down. When we had a budget surplus 1997 to 2001. And then we've got a jerk back up here in 2001, and a significant increase in the recession in 2009. All right. Now, here's the thing that hurts us year to year. We could keep pushing out this debt forever, because when the bond that I sold Crystal comes due, I could pay her back by selling a different bond to someone else. Right? I could just roll that over. One problem with that is we have to pay interest on that. So interest on the debt. Some people just say, gosh, that's wasted money. Just wasted money. Interest on all this debt. Shouldn't we be spending that on schools or anything besides just wasted money? So net interest as a percentage of GDP. Right now we're at, I guess, 1 to 1.5%. All right, doesn't sound terrible, but it's a lot of money. $16 trillion, 1.5% of $16 trillion. Awful large payment. All right, what can be done to curb this national debt? start our discussion of how we're going to fix this problem.
Unfortunately, tax increase.
Tax increase? We could. What happens though if we increase taxes? Well, there's some problems we looked at earlier that may be a
And
cooling.
decrease
Yeah,
tax revenue.
yeah, and
Yeah,
decreasing.
you need to increase that tax revenue, though. You need to bring in money somewhere.
All right, so we increase tax revenue. Maybe we can use the Laffer curve to get that maximum amount of revenue. There are problems with that, of course. So we'll think about that as one of our tools. Spending caps. Stop spending. How about that?
That could be feasible.
Be feasible. All right, that could be a way that we're going to do it.
It would. I think it would lead to a stagnation, though, because you're no longer growing. You're stable. You're not growing. So, I mean, yeah, it would stop your debt, but I don't think it would decrease it.
Yeah, well, didn't we just spend the whole
You need
whatever
the
hour
profitability.
talking about
Yeah.
how increasing spending was a very valuable way for us to spur this
Right.
economy?
Yeah.
So
I don't
there's,
think that would work.
there's some pros and cons there. All right, how about a debt ceiling? We could say debt ceiling is $16 trillion. We're not allowed to borrow more than that.
That's exactly what the national debt's doing. They're just raising the ceiling.
They just raise
They're
the ceiling.
increasing debt.
Right. So Congress just passes a law to raise the debt ceiling. That's what ultimately happens. But what happens before they do that? Like when they're deciding whether or not they want to do that? What happens in Washington?
Don't they have a lame duck Congress on the budget?
Well, they shut down the government. They argue. They start casting blame. And then they say, okay, fine, let's just increase the debt ceiling.
Right.
So ultimately, the debt ceiling is not a factor other than the fact that it leads to a lot of argument and finger pointing before the debt ceiling increases. Legislative legal limit. Congress usually raises the ceiling to accommodate the budget deficits. All right. Should we be worried about this national debt? Let's ask 3 questions. 1. Can the federal government go bankrupt?
Yeah.
Yeah, they could.
I mean,
Okay.
we're pretty close.
2.
I mean,
Yeah.
you can't really pay it off.
Okay. All right. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about that, or not a lot, just a few minutes. The second question: are Americans passing the debt burden on to their children? Yeah, there's some potential good news there, and I alluded to it earlier. I mentioned it earlier when I said, well, what if we're the ones holding this debt? Right? And there's some offset there. And 3, does government borrowing crowd out private sector spending? Meaning, if the U.S. government is borrowing $16 trillion, does that make it harder for a business owner to borrow money and grow their business? And it does a little bit. Right? If the federal government is borrowing $16 trillion, that makes it a little harder for those loanable funds to come my way if I want to build my business and grow the economy. So let's look at each of those 3. Can the federal government go bankrupt? As Luke pointed out, yes. Yes, it can. All right, any entity that continues to operate in the red can go bankrupt. It could be like Greece, right?
What happens when we go bankrupt?
Yeah, I don't think we want to think about that.
Horrible.
Greece
Right.
is
I was
pretty
just there
close.
when their name Athens is like so run down.
Yeah.
It's just disgusting.
Well, the credit, so there's not money for government
And there's
services.
like barely any jobs. They're like still picketing for like the crowds have decreased. They were still there when we were going around. I guess there was like huge uproars and yeah.
So against the picketers, saying why are you?
Well, no, the picketers were like up in arms with the government, and they were just picketing. And now there's
Okay.
less and less, and I guess all the youth now too are not going to staying there, and they're moving elsewhere. So it's making it even worse. They say.
Yeah. So, and the creditors of Greece, they could say, all right, it's just like a bankruptcy, right? It's like now we own the, what do you call that, the Parthenon, the famous Greek thing
yeah.
in Athens. Like, all right, you took our money, we have entitlements now, so now we own you, and we're going to go take our piece of everything you own. I don't know exactly how it works out, or there may have been rules rules against. You can't take our famous Greek statues.
I mean, it's happening with other smaller
Well, the
countries.
Germans were trying to set up rules as to what the Greeks could do, how they could spend. That's where there was the run on the banks, because they weren't supposed to give so much money out to people while they were savings. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Germans were not.
And it's hurting the German banks too, because
Yeah.
now no one wants to loan out and no one wants to take out loans from German banks.
Oh, because
Because
the
they lost
Germans.
their interest rate power.
Oh, okay. Wait, so the
What?
so the Germans. So the Germans they lost money. So are they lost?
I shouldn't say money. People
Well,
are
yeah,
less
they lost
enticed to borrow because the banks aren't loaning out.
Okay, because the Germans are just skittish now that they're losing money in Greece.
Right.
Okay, and they had all that money that they're not getting back, so they don't have more money to loan out to build their economy and whatnot. So domino effect. Yeah, absolutely. So we could go bankrupt. However, there's no deadline when federal government debt must be paid off. We could just keep rolling this over.
But it's like you said with government services. I mean, I think it's Venezuela too. They have to shut off their utilities off peak to offset their state-controlled electricity because they can't pay for the infrastructure to fix it.
Right. Right.
So you gotta think like necessities
We
need to be done.
Oh my gosh. So what? All right. Things like this could possibly happen. We don't think it's too realistic, but we have a $17 trillion debt. We only make $17 trillion a year. And what if we experience another recession? That could get bigger. What if people stop loaning us money? Remember we were downgraded? Our credit rating in 2012? Our credit rating was downgraded. They said you are no longer a prime candidate for us to loan money because the strength of your financial system is in question. So we had to start paying higher interest rates. I don't remember what happened since then. I think we've been upgraded again. I don't remember, but so we were considered a credit risk for a while. Okay, so this is potentially a big problem, but also potentially one we could keep pushing off. Are we passing the debt burden on to our children? Yes. Right? If we have $17 trillion we need to pay off, someone needs to pay that off. Someone needs to keep paying interest payments on it. But there is some good news. If the bulk of the debt is internally owned, that's a good thing for our economy, or any economy that has national debt. If the citizens within that economy are the ones holding that debt, that is potentially a good thing. That is a good thing. So suppose that $17 trillion, it was all of us in this room were holding a security that says the United States government will pay you, $3 trillion each. Well, we'll divide it up by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of us. So we have a security that says, whatever that is, $2.5 trillion each. So, do we think national debt is a problem now? Are we passing this burden on to our children? We could be worried about the default risk, but the U.S. government is a very what do you call it? They have a high credit rating. I just mentioned earlier that we were downgraded, but we were the highest, and then we were just one below the highest. And then I think we went back up to the highest. So let's say we're not worried about default. The federal government is going to have to spend 3% or 2% of their budget each year, or percent of GDP, paying us interest payments. But we're getting that money, and that's going to be better for us and our families. Now, suppose we were municipal governments, state governments, local governments. Right, suppose we're the town of Dobbs Ferry. We're holding a security that says the federal government must pay you $100 million. So as the government keeps paying interest on that, that's benefiting the citizens of this community.
So there should be a separate number. Internal.
Yes, internal versus external. Excellent. There is a separate number, and we'll talk about that. That's some of the potential good news. The bad news with that, though, is it benefits us in this room because we're holding those debt securities. What about the people in the other classroom that aren't holding any debt securities? Does it benefit them and their children?
No, because they don't have debt.
Exactly. It benefits the holders of the security disproportionately. And it is something that people will look at and say, we're transferring wealth to people who are holding these debt instruments. People have the ability to loan money to the federal government. Ones who are financing our budget deficits, they are the ones benefiting disproportionately.
That's going to be how they're going to have to solve it first, though. They won't be able to get rid of the debt. They're going to have to influence the ratio to have more internal than external.
Okay, so we could convince...
Stimulate like a technological boom, renewable energy or something like that.
Yeah, we could get...
Something to
Right.
really boost spending.
We'll get companies to loan the federal government money.
Right.
Yeah, or get private citizens to loan the federal government money. Right, that would be some good news.
They tax our interest on bonds.
They do. We do have to pay taxes on interest. Often bonds, government bonds will be taxed, the interest will be tax-free. Sometimes they will be, sometimes they won't.
When New York City was getting ready to go bankrupt, and I guess when Ford was president, and Ford said, basically, forget New York, or he said it more graphically. But actually, folks in New York, what they did is they went to some of the billionaires who own the high-rise buildings and asked them to pay their taxes early. And so by virtue of their paying their taxes early, they were able to, the city tax, property taxes, they were able to avert bankruptcy for New York City.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So one thing, hopefully, we won't have to do on the federal government level, pay our taxes early. All right. Hopefully, that won't become a realistic possibility soon of us actually going bankrupt. That's a good tidbit. So, all right. So if we're holding debt, then we're not passing the debt burden on to our children. But people who are not holding debt, they are passing the debt burden on to their children. Similarly, if Dobbs Ferry, the city of Dobbs Ferry, is holding debt, they are benefiting us in our community. But communities that don't hold debt, they're the ones that disproportionately suffer as a result of a high national debt. So, Lonnie brought up this point. Let's think about internal versus external. Who is holding this debt? So 42% is held by public sector, federal, state, local governments, like, say, the city of Dobbs Ferry, and reserve banks. 25% is held by private sector individuals, corporations, insurance companies. So could be you and I holding these government securities. Could be companies, right, who are able to grow their business because they're getting interest payments. And yeah. And then we have a small percent, 33%, held by foreigners. All right, so the issue there is that's great for those people who are holding debt, and we're happy for them, but when we're sending interest payments to them, it doesn't benefit our economy. So any economy where there's a large percentage of foreigners holding the debt, the interest payments are not benefiting that economy directly. So as far as we're concerned, that is not ideal. We want to be paying less in interest, but if we are paying interest, we want there to have some virtuous cycle of those interest payments benefiting the economy. So the amount of internal versus external is a concern. Internal debt, the portion of national debt we owe to a nation's own citizens, versus external debt, the portion of debt owed to foreign citizens. All right, so where are we at? We've got a problem with national debt. We're not too worried about going bankrupt. We're not terribly worried about passing on the debt burden to our children, but there is a problem, though, with that disproportionately benefiting people who are holding the actual debt. And if we have a large amount of external debt, right, that's that could be fine for political reasons as we're developing trade associations with other countries, but that money, bottom line, is not benefiting our economy.
Why does the disproportionate benefit, why does that matter? Just people are upset.
Oh, well, it's so all of us in the room are holding the whole $16 trillion of debt. All right, we're going to benefit from that as the federal government pays that interest to us and pays that back to
Because
us.
you let them borrow money, right?
Yeah, we loaned it to them.
So you did them a favor.
Yeah.
So why are the other people mad?
Because they have to pay interest that goes into our pockets. The people in the other classroom, they're the ones paying for the
So
national.
do economists really care if people are just mad that they have to pay this? Because
Okay,
you know what
so
I mean? Like,
yeah.
does it really matter, or is it just people are upset?
Well, it transfers wealth to people who are holding these debt instruments and the people in the next classroom who are not.
You'd rather transfer that wealth to national rather than a foreign government, right?
Okay, well,
Because-
let's come back to that.
Oh.
That's slightly separate. But let me pose this question: who do you think is holding the debt? Is it the rich people or the poor people?
Rich.
It's typically people who have more money who are holding the debt. So we have a greater income inequality, and that can present a problem.
I have like 3 bonds. That's it.
Can present a problem if we can't get the political support because the people who aren't able to afford debt are disproportionately being, benefited against. Then that's going to have some problems, have some political implications. So inequality can be a significant problem. Classical economists will say, well, what's the problem? Everybody benefits as long as there's more money. But as income inequality, and I think we talked about this.
It's kind of like they made an investment and just had the money to make the investment. So why should other people be upset? I know what you mean.
Yeah, well,
Why makes sense?
and this problem is not going to go away, even though we could come up with a solution tonight, this problem is not going to go away soon. So this interest is going to be paid for years and years to come. So it's great for us that we're holding these debt instruments, but the people in the next classroom, they're the ones paying it. So it's going to continue. That divide is going to
There's
continue.
also the risk factor of the bonds. So, like, say, if you don't want someone, if you want to pay it back over a longer term, the person who's lending it to you, they're going to want their money back as soon as possible.
Yeah, sure.
And is the interest tax-free as well?
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
I always
Was it?
have to pay taxes.
What is it? Municipal bonds are tax-free. Munis are
Some
tax-free, right?
Some state bonds are tax-free.
Some state.
And
I
some.
pay for school with U.S. Treasury bonds, and I have to pay income. They count the interest toward my income taxes.
Yeah, definitely interest as a rule is taxable, but there are some government bonds that are tax-free. Now they typically pay a lower interest rate. The financiers have it all worked out that they can pay you a lower interest rate if it's tax-free. So, all right. Let's say crowding out effect. This last little piece. So the crowding out effect I mentioned, when the government is borrowing all this money, it might make it harder for Stephanie to borrow money to start her business. And if she was able to borrow money to start her business, then that would have a very positive effect on the economy. So, is this something that happens? When the government borrows money, does that make it harder for Stephanie? It does. Of course, it does. $16 trillion needs to be borrowed. This is to make interest rates a little bit higher. So on the one hand, yes, it does. And economists call that the crowding out effect. So that hurts us as well in our attempt to have entrepreneurs get us out of this recession, because there's no clear way we can get out of a recession because there's so many pros and cons to everything. That could have a negative effect. However, if this borrowing occurs during an economic downturn, economists argue that Stephanie probably wouldn't be starting a business anyway in the middle of a recession. So it's okay that the government is borrowing all the money. Does that make sense? So they say, all right, it doesn't matter as much because this is occurring during an economic downturn. So it's not the worst possible thing, this crowding out effect. It's not hurting the growth of our economy that much. Questions? So where does this leave us in our quest to solve the national debt problem? What do we come up with as potential solutions?
I'm thinking of something really out there now. Increase government spending and exports through mass war.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just thinking.
Okay, but how would that bring money in? Okay, so you want everyone else fighting a
Spur
war.
production. I mean, think of, like World War II. You know, the economy was booming before the war. And then, you know, people died, people recovered.
Okay. I guess as long as someone else is fighting a war and we're financing, then that's good.
It goes back to what I previously said. I think we need like a large-scale technological boom. Like the last time you saw an economy such an expansive growth, it was like the Industrial Revolution. You need like something that brings in a more of a domestic internal glut of resources.
Right. This is demand, and we have our aggregate supply. Let's shift this aggregate supply.
Right.
All right.
I'm not saying you don't have economic alliances or you know, you go into complete isolationism, but you need something.
I like it. Shift this massively. And let's do it not the way Ronald Reagan did it, with just benefiting, well, not just benefiting, with let's see if we can avoid the criticism that we're just benefiting big businesses and really rich people. Let's have a massive technological shift that benefits everyone. I like it. Did you all watch the debate last night? No? There's some interesting discussion. The guy moderating, what was his name? Charlie? Chris
Wallace.
Chris Wallace. He said, our national debt is currently at, I think, 77% of our GDP. So it's gone down since 2013. It's now at 77%. And he said, Donald Trump, your spending plan would increase GDP to 107%, and Hillary Clinton, your spending plan would increase GDP to, I think, 89%. So both of their plans, according to Chris Wallace, would increase our debt as a percentage of GDP. Donald Trump a little bit more. And then they argued about that for a while. I don't know if you caught one thing that Hillary Clinton said. I don't know if she misspoke or not. She said that Donald Trump's plan would increase the national debt by $20 trillion. Like, I think I heard that. I had on my list to watch that again just to make sure I heard that right. She accused him of his plan increasing the national debt by $20 trillion. So doubling.
Actually, the New York Times disproved that. They like debunked it. They call it debunk facting.
Oh, Hillary's statement?
Yeah.
Like that one?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
The New York Times stated that I was reading it in an article actually before class, stating that in just 4 years, even if he doesn't get reelected, it's not economically plausible to double it.
Yeah. So good. I wasn't even sure if I heard that right. So there's been discussion about that. All right. So I thought no, that's she just.
And there was a couple of them for her and him as well. So.
Yeah. And then Donald Trump started talking. I didn't understand what he meant by that. He said, we're going to go to 1%, and then we're going to go to 4%. I didn't know exactly what he meant by that.
Growing the economy.
So GDP, we're going to grow the GDP by 1% and then 4%. All right.
When I was just thinking about how to shift the supply curve in my head. I was thinking, maybe we could spend less, like maybe reusing things before buying new, or that kind of concept. But does the government like the idea of recycling, or would they not like that because you're not spending money? But
Yeah.
even though
So
they act like they
right. So if we're recycling, there is going to be a little bit of this demand effect, right? Right. So and that would decrease prices, I guess, but that would decrease. Full employment is here. Okay, this is full employment, star. All right, and the new equilibrium would be here. So there could be a temporary problem with that. But there could be great benefits for that over the long term. And also that could create recycling, manufacturing jobs combined with this technological shift where we're going to deal with recyclable materials in a more efficient fashion. So there could be transition problems, which is tough. And you think you have a great idea, but there are transition problems. So, all right. Well, great discussion. That's it for tonight. Again, just there's 2 chapters. I posted the quiz, and I based everything on the quiz questions on just stuff we discussed tonight. I didn't even really look too carefully at the quiz questions in the back of each chapter. So just go through these slides, and you should be in good shape for the quiz. All right. See you next week.